Hi, good afternoon. Some of you I know, actually many of you I know, and for those of you I don't, welcome to the Graduate School of Social Work. As Phil mentioned, I'm currently a doctoral student here. I've also done the Animal Assisted Social Work Certificate program and got my master's here many years ago. And so, as part of the doctoral program, we're required to take certain classes, but if DU doesn't offer them, we're able to go outside of our own university and seek the classes that we need. And so my obviously interest is human-animal connection, and so I was Googling ethics classes, and Dr. Rollin's name came up at CSU, and I said, I can drive to CSU once a week for our class. And I did, and fortuitously, because it was an excellent class, and I had the pleasure of getting to know Dr. Rollin. Dr. Rollin is a distinguished professor at Colorado State University, where he's been since 1969. He got his PhD from Columbia University in philosophy, was a Fulbright scholar to the University of Edinburgh, and since then he has authored 19 books, 1,600 international lectures he's given, over 700 articles, and he would like me to make sure that I mention that he's ridden over 250,000 miles on motorcycles, and that his lifetime bench press record was 505 pounds. So I'm incredibly impressed by all of that. I think part of Dr. Rollin's strength is he can mediate to both sides of the animal rights and animal welfare debates that go on in our country as well as around the world. And he was part of drafting the 1985 amendments to our Animal Welfare Act here in the United States, as well as chartering IACUC, which is the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. And so, without further ado, I would like to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Bernard Rollin.
Guys hear me okay? Yes. Good. Appreciate being here. This is a very impressive program you've got and much needed. And if Jen is any indication of the quality of your student, you're blessed. I usually start with a joke, but I can't think of one. I will tell you something rather interesting. She mentioned that I wrote the federal laws for lab animals. Do any of you work with animals in research? Okay, well, I'm going to ask you a question and see what your intuitions tell you. My bill appeared before Henry Waxman's committee in 1982. It was 10 years from the time we wrote it till the time it passed. Enormous amount of public support, I must tell you. Hatred, blind hatred from the research community. That's okay. But obviously, the pivotal question when you're talking about using animals in research is how much pain and suffering you cause, right? And some of it is pretty extensive. Some of the research that I've seen with my own eyes was pretty painful. So we mandated analgesia and other modalities for controlling pain in '82. And Waxman said, prove to us that that's needed. The research community denies that it's needed, that they use liberal amounts of analgesia, and therefore this is superfluous, it's going to cost the taxpayer money for no reason, and so forth. I said, well, I know from telephone calls I get that they don't use any analgesia. Well, Waxman said, they give us a lot more money than you do, so the burden of proof is on you to prove that they don't. So I was puzzled. I mean, how the hell do you go out and prove that? I mean, I could have brought in technicians galore who would say, no, we want them to use analgesia, and they don't. But then they'd bring in deans who would say they do, and deans trump technicians, wrongly, by the way. But that's the way it works. So I thought about it for a week, and I went out and did a literature search, analgesia for laboratory animals. April 1982, how many papers did I find? That's actually a better guess than I usually get. The answer was 2, one of which said there should be papers. I redid the search 2 years ago, so that's approximately 25 years after the bill passed. Guess what I found? 12,000. They invited me to Italy to lecture on this, and I said, maybe that'll keep me out of hell. Never say anything like that in Italy. You know, they believe in that stuff. I got 40 emails from Italian female scientists telling me, don't worry, you're not going to hell. Doesn't help me on dark nights, you know. I think of all the commandments I've broken. Okay, what I'm going to do is give you a very quick flyover of the same, essentially the material covered in my title, Animal Rights as a Mainstream. You say animal rights, people either assume that you're out throwing bombs, you know, or they assume that you don't appreciate the role of animals in society, or you're this kind of activist, that kind of activist, blah, blah, blah. What differentiates me from everybody else is, number one, as Jen said, I'm credible to both sides. Not liked, but credible. Liked is overrated. Get things done is much, much better. I'm very proud of the fact that I convinced Smithfield a couple years ago to give up sow crates. You know what those are? What they keep the mama pig in? 2 foot by 3 foot by 6 foot. It's an obscenity. It's an absolute obscenity. And, you know, a large part of my success has been my ability to make a rational case, which generally provokes irrationality from the opponents, which is really lovely for a philosopher, you know? People go crazy and foam at the mouth and call you names and stuff. And I found that it's okay to call them names back. Or even, on some occasion, to threaten to take them outside, kick their butt, which is even more satisfying. Anyway, the last 50 years have witnessed a dazzling array of social ethical revolutions in Western society. Most of you guys are not old enough to be able to recollect back 50 years, but we've seen feminism. We've seen, I mean, there was no, when I went to college in the 60s, there was no word feminism. Didn't exist, you know? Civil rights, environmentalism, affirmative action, consumer advocacy, pro and anti-abortion activism, gay rights, children's rights, the student movement, anti-war activism, public rejection of biotechnology, have all forever changed the way public and private institutions can do business. Private enterprise must be perceived as in concord with social ethics, or they lose custom. And you could make the argument that morally based boycotting of South African businesses was instrumental in bringing about the end of apartheid. This is not widely known, but when I was in South Africa, my scientist friends told me that because they were South Africa, they could not get American journals in science or medicine. It had to be sent in by individuals. They could not subscribe. The environmental issue is funny because in 1966, when I graduated from City College in New York, they did a survey of what graduates thought were major societal issues. And I mentioned the environment. Out of 2,500 respondents, I was the only one who mentioned the environment in '66. And that was when we had a river in Ohio. You know about this? Called the Cuyahoga, where it was a cheap date to take your date to the Cuyahoga, throw a match and watch it burst into flames. That was '66. 4 years later was Earth Day. And by the way, that's considered the holy grail for advertising. The advertising people want to figure out how we could change that much in 4 years and apply it, you know, to Pepsi. Okay? Cigarette companies press upon the public a message that cigarettes kill. Liquor companies advertise for moderation. They should live so long. They don't want moderation. They want to be perceived as on the side of the angels. Forestry and oil companies spend billions on affirming their commitment to environmentalism and conservation. Those of us who are a little older a little skeptical, right? And CNN has reported that green investment funds grew significantly faster than ordinary funds. And reports of child labor or sweatshop working conditions can destroy product markets overnight. Not only is success tied to accord with social ethics, but even more fundamentally, freedom and autonomy are as well. After all, what is professional ethics? Society says to professions, be it physicians, lawyers, veterinarians, whatever it may be, you comport yourself the way we would tell you to comport yourself if we understood what the hell you were doing, which we don't, but we will know if you screw up and then we'll hammer you. It's a great example of that that goes back. I know that everybody in this audience is now aware of the issue of antibiotics in animal feeds. I was on the Pew Commission and we looked into that in great detail. We had the full professor of infectious disease from Harvard on our committee. You know, we were really well armed, and there's no question that overuse of antibiotics in animals has a major and significant impact on human health. Some of you may be familiar with MRSA. You know, that's a good example. But actually, people were cognizant of that issue as early as 1946. There was an article in the Journal of Microbiology which said, yeah, these are wonder drugs, but if you overuse them in animals, and the way in which they're overused is they're fed to animals as part of the feeding package, and thereby accelerates growth by some mechanism that nobody's quite clear about, but it's empirically been proven. Congress got concerned about this in the early 70s and did some checking on where these antibiotics came from, and the aid said came from veterinarians using it what's called off-label. You know what that means? In a way that the label doesn't prescribe, but you're free if you have a relationship with a client to use that drug as a prescription. You're of course not immune from liability, but you're at least immune from government action. And this particular congressperson said, well, hell, if veterinarians are abusing the privilege, then we'll just take prescription writing away from them. Those of you who know anything about veterinary medicine would have known that that would have been the end of veterinary medicine as we know it. It would have resorted back to some sort of witch doctory, because virtually everything that veterinarians prescribe is, certainly in those days, was human drugs used off-label. Fortunately for both pet owners and veterinarians, that law did not pass. Well, one major social ethical concern that I didn't mention that's developed over the last 4 decades is a significant amount of concern with the treatment of animals in society. Those of you who are a bit older may have seen that happen, occupying more and more printed page and more and more of mass media. I mean, you talk to a reporter. This is an interesting story. I was in Redlands, California, when that surgeon tried to transplant the baboon heart into baby Faye. Any of you remember that? Actually, that wasn't so much an animal issue because the animal was not hurt. It was put under anesthesia, the heart taken, and it was put in the baby. It was a human research issue, which glaringly violated all our constraints on the use of human beings in research. But I was at that university there, and the story broke, and the reporters converged on us like maggots on a carcass. And a guy walked up to me and he said, well, is it the monkey or the kid? And I said, that's a damn stupid question, you know. That's not even the kind of issue it is. You got 4 hours, I'll explain the issue to you in words of 1 syllable. And so he said, no, is it the monkey or the kid? And I said, I'm not giving you sound bites. It's not the issue. So I started to walk away, and I must say he beat me, and it doesn't happen that often. He grabbed me, spun me around, which I hate, and he said, "What if it was your kid?" And you know what I said? What any father would say. If it was my kid, I'd tear your goddamn heart out. I came back to CSU, and the kids are smiling like the cat that swallowed the canary. Because it was out on all the wires, you know? So don't get suckered into doing that. According to both the National Cattlemen's Association and the NIH, no friends of animal rights, right? That much you guys know. Congress has been getting more contacts on animal-related issues since 1980 than any other single issue, any other issue. And the only reason they trumpet that is they want their people to be aware. You see? 30 years ago, you would have found no bills in the U.S. Congress relating to animal welfare, and yet recent years have witnessed dozens of such bills, ranging from curtailing the parrot trade to saving marine mammals from tuna fishermen. In fact, next Tuesday, I was invited by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Some of you may want to try to get into that. They're crushing ivory that has been seized from people who bought it from poachers. And unfortunately, we have a state agricultural committee meeting that same day. But it might be a rewarding, albeit depressing thing to see. 8 states have abolished the steel-jawed trap, as have 90 countries. You all know what the steel-jawed trap is? Okay. When the State Wildlife Commission failed to act on a recommendation from the Division of Wildlife to abolish the spring bear hunt, do any of you remember that? You can hunt bear in the spring or in the fall because in the winter they're asleep. They're hibernating. And when you have a spring bear hunt, you have the mama bear with cubs out foraging, the lactating mother. And the objection was that people who are in the hunting frenzy don't know a male bear from a female bear, and they shoot the female, and the cubs will die. There is no question that the cubs will die. It's 100% of every time it's been observed. And so naturally, you don't want dying bear cubs. When the Colorado legislature and the Wildlife Commission refused to act on the recommendation to abolish the spring bear hunt, 70% of Colorado public voted for this as a constitutional amendment. An amendment to the Constitution. We hold these truths to be self-evident. There should be no bear hunt. You see? The only right of referendum we have in Colorado is to amend. Am I not clear? Oh, thanks. Oh. I figured either the sound system wasn't working or I said something that pissed him off. Thank you. In fact, wildlife managers have worried about what one scholar calls management by referendum, when the public feels that the wildlife people aren't accountable to the general public, which by and large they're not. Who pays the salaries of wildlife officers? Which subgroup? That's hunting and fishing licenses. You see? So those people have always felt responsible to the hunters, trappers, and fishermen. And so what's happened is when their policies are not congenial to that of regular people, what % of the public hunts, do you know? 6 and declining. It's become an object of social disapproval to say you hunt, you know, especially for urban people, you know? And so when people want things changed with regard to wildlife, like, for example, in California, where the public by referendum abolished the hunting of mountain lions. And of course, the rednecks did a big campaign about all the people who were killed by mountain lions. But I'll tell you something very interesting. I don't know if you remember that a jogger who had 2 little kids was killed by mountain lions, what, 10 years ago? Is that about right? And the mama lion was also killed by the Division of Wildlife. Both left 2 offspring. The money coming in for the baby lions was 20 times that of what was coming in for the people. And that's been documented before and since in New Mexico. People care about animals, there's no question. The worldwide proliferation of laws to protect laboratory animals has occurred in the last 30 years. There really was no protection for laboratory animals anywhere, with the exception of Great Britain. Some of you may have lived in Britain or gone to school there. They had the Act of 1876 that, among other people, Darwin wrote, and has some strange things by American standards. If you wanted to learn surgery, you were not allowed to learn on animals that were unwanted or purchased for that purpose or whatever. So effectively, your first year of veterinary practice was a surgical internship. You see? Contrast that with CSU in 1978, when I arrived in there to teach ethics. I had been at CSU some time, but they asked me to teach veterinary ethics, which didn't exist. They didn't tell me that. But we taught surgery by using the same dog 9 times over 3 weeks. And if you wanted to care for your animal, you had to cut class. So the British Act of 1876 was a very progressive movement. And you ask American surgeons, are the British any worse surgeons than you are? They'll say yes. But people who've experienced both systems will say no. There are lots of ways to learn a field like surgery. And being under the pressure of cutting on a dog multiply is a good way not to learn, because you're stressed out beyond belief. I remember going to Brussels and meeting with the chief USDA vet for Europe. And he said, "Where are you from?" I said, "CSU." He said, "I graduated from CSU." He said, I said, "You missed me. I don't remember having you in class." He said, "When did you start teaching?" I said, 78. He said, "I graduated in 77. What do you teach?" I said, "I teach ethics and animal welfare." And he leaped out of his chair and grabbed me in a bear hug. Big hug. I said, "Thank you. To what do I owe this singular event?" He said, "Are you the guy who abolished that multiple surgery?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I just want to thank you." He said, "Because I almost quit vet school over that." He said, "Not that I'm a pussy." He said, "I killed people as a ranger in Vietnam, but I almost quit over that dog, so thank you." You know? So many animal uses have been abolished without legislation if they're perceived as frivolous. Toxicological testing of cosmetics. A company called The Body Shop very intelligently about 20 years ago began to disavow that they do any experiments on animals. Of course, they had a whole literature of previous companies that they could draw from, because let's face it, what's a big innovation in cosmetics? 95% of perfume budget goes to packaging. You know? I've thought of it myself. Bernie. I mean, look at those ads that those guys put out there. Calvin Klein and all that. Doesn't cost anything to make perfume. Greyhound racing is virtually dead in the United States. All over the West Coast, the tracks have closed. And people don't care about greyhound racing. Why do they go to greyhound racing? Bingo. You nailed it. And so you can actually show races from 25 years ago. They don't give a damn. In fact, there's a guy at CSU, he's an entomologist. When we have ag days, he races cockroaches. And if there was money on it, you can imagine, right? So nobody cares, but greyhounds were really abused in that industry, majorly abused. And we know this firsthand because CSU would get greyhounds that they didn't want anymore and said, go ahead, use them for teaching. And we did, and it wasn't a good thing, but it was better than being clubbed to death. I don't know if you remember, sir, they found a cache of dead greyhounds in northern New Mexico. It was headlined in all the papers, beaten to death. I'd rather be anesthetized, thanks. Zoos that are little more than prisons have virtually disappeared. When I got to Colorado, I went up to Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, and the giraffe was mostly outdoors, but in the winter, he had an enclosure that was not big enough for him to stand up. Can you imagine if that happened today? The day would not end before they would be closed down. Genetic engineering has been rejected in Europe. You all know that. You can't get GMOs in Europe, and you can't buy GMO products. And in part, they've been rejected because they've become associated with hurting animals, and rightly so. That's why, what was the inaugural product for genetically modified substances? Do you remember? BST, bovine somatotropin, that increased the milk from cows. And we're talking about an animal that has already been bred for maximal milk production anyway, and then you add this drug on top of it. And you probably all know the problems with dairy cows: infertility, dystocia, lameness, skin and bones. Any of you ever seen the big California dairies? 10,000 cows. Did you look close, sir? Remember what the flooring was? Concrete. This is for an animal whose foot has evolved for walking on soft loam. And now they're 24/7, 365 on concrete, and they wonder why lameness is a problem, you know? And then those bastards, pardon me, had the nerve to advertise the happy cows in California. Guys remember that? It's only been gone for 2 years. And I happened to give a keynote speech to the California Dairy Association, and I told them, you guys are duplicitous and stupid. Because eventually the public, that's because I took the Dale Carnegie course, how to make friends and influence people. And I said, go out and ask your public what they think, you know? They wrote me a letter back, so help me God. I couldn't make this up. I'm not dumb enough. Maybe a few more years, but not now. They asked people on the streets of LA, sort of like Jimmy Kimmel does, do you believe those cows talk? Because in the ads they talk, you know? And people said, no, they don't. I said, that's not the duplicity. The duplicity is that they live and eat on green pasture. A friend of mine who was the top veterinarian at David said, those cows never see a blade of grass. And so I said that in my talk at the Dairy Association. And lo and behold, within 6 months, they had dumped those ads and were doing the family farm stuff. You know? Family farm, by the way, doesn't mean squat, because some of the biggest industrial operations, Murphy Farms, are the Murphy brothers. There actually are Murphy brothers, and they raise pigs, but they raise pigs in total paradigmatic factory conditions, you see? The agricultural community in general has been way behind societal concern. There is one monumental issue that is omnipresent in ag industry's response to concerns about farm animal welfare. Really a stupendous error. If you discuss farm animal welfare with people in the ag industry, have any of you done that? What you get is it all has to be based on sound science. Does that ring a bell? Now, by the way, what does sound science mean? It means science they have bought and paid for. People in agriculture, there's not that much money available for research. If you want to be an academic, you've got to publish. To publish, you've got to bring in money. To bring in money, you've got to keep the industry on your side. And if I ever come back, I'll tell you some stories about people who violated that to be honorable and what happened to their careers, you know? Anyway, AVMA in 2008 had been studying sow stalls, and they issued a report finally. By the way, the same month that Smithfield told me they were going to eliminate them, Smithfield eliminated them because they listened to me and went out and polled their customers, and I said 75% find sow stalls unacceptable. They called me up and said, you were wrong, it's 78%. The American Veterinary Medical Association said that there's no scientific reason for preferring any sow system to any other. And I have been trying to beat through their thick skulls that it's not a scientific question. What kind of question is it? Exactly, good for you. It's an ethical question, you know? And yet the entire industry believes that you got to appeal to sound science. You know what I mean? When I served on the Pew Commission, we encountered this regularly. The very first meeting we had, you know what the Pew Commission was? On industrial farm animal production? It was the first objective report on confinement agriculture since it started, roughly at the time of World War II. And we had 15 brilliant people on there and me for comic relief. I did pretty good. No, I was the animal welfare guy. And we figured we better start off right with the industry. So we met with industry representatives in a public meeting in Des Moines, Iowa. And they had a whole bunch of people from the industry speaking. And they got this woman who was dressed up like Little House from the Prairie, whatever that Little House on the Prairie, you know, with a gingham dress and a bonnet and all that. And she got up and said, well, you know, we're kind of nervous about this here commission because, you know, I look around at this commission, they're city people. They don't know anything about agriculture. Some of them even Jews, you know? She didn't say that. I was reading it off the balloon on top of her head, you know? She said, but we're comfortable with this commission if everything you say is based on sound science. So I said, hi, Mike. So I said, ma'am, let me try to explain it to you. If we wanted to learn how to raise pigs in little boxes, we'd go to science. It would tell us optimal diet, it would tell us optimal temperature, lighting cycles, the whole shtick, right? But that's not what society or the commission is asking. The society and the commission are asking, ought we to raise pigs in confinement? And I said, to that question, science is not relevant. And I mean, she was priceless. She said, huh? So I gathered that I didn't come across well. Questions of animal welfare are at least partly ought questions, right? How ought we treat these animals under our aegis? Science certainly brings relevant data to that question, but it's not a strictly scientific question. When we ask about an animal's welfare in confinement or in laboratories, we're essentially asking about what we owe the animal and to what extent. Fair enough? Because we're controlling their lives. Fair enough? Even in nature, if we're talking about a strictly wild animal, independent of human contact, if we ask about its welfare, it's going to depend where you come from in terms of your belief what animals optimally ought to have. The ought suggesting that it's a moral question, right? One of the first documents put out by the industry in the early 80s was called the CAST report, the Council on Agricultural Science and Technology report on farm animal welfare, because there were beginning to be stirrings in the minds of the public. And they said, farm animal welfare means that the animal is productive. A productive animal enjoys positive welfare. A non-productive animal enjoys poor welfare. Any of you accept that? How would you criticize it?
Whose welfare?
Their own welfare.
The owners.
The owners, well, that's true. And by the way, that's the beginning of a good answer to my question, because productivity is an economic notion predicated of a whole farm, a whole operation, a whole factory. Welfare is predicated of individual animals. See that? So that's right away a logical error. An operation such as caged laying hens may be quite profitable if the cages are severely overcrowded, yet the individual animals do not enjoy good welfare. Counterexample. There is some legitimacy to equating productivity and welfare when you're dealing, as I'll talk later, with animal husbandry, traditional ways of raising animals, where the only way to get the animals to be productive was to make sure they were well off before technology, you see? But that's certainly not true in factory farms, where you have technological sanders that let you force square pegs into round holes. Okay? Antibiotics, feed additives, vaccines, air handling systems, hormones, bacterins, etc. You take those away from intensive animal agriculture, and those animals are dead in a month. Just as simple as that. Okay? And I'll go back to talking about husbandry and industry a little bit. So, I mean, what the CAST report says is what we owe the animals in terms of welfare is simply what it takes to get them to create profit. Now, some of you may remember that in the early 60s in Great Britain, there was a book that revealed what agriculture really was by Ruth Harrison, called Animal Machines. And that prompted the British public to demand a royal commission of inquiry called the Bramble Commission. And that in turn sparked a group called the Farm Animal Welfare Council that defined animal welfare in terms of, have you heard the phrase 5 freedoms? Freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain and injury, freedom to express normal behavior, freedom from fear and distress. Okay? Now that's clearly a moral notion, right? That list. But it's a very different moral notion than the one the CAST report enunciated. Okay? And the point is, the really deep philosophical point is we can't decide between those two definitions by gathering facts. Right? It's based in our ethical presuppositions on what does it take to run a farm animal properly. Suppose you follow the CAST report and believe that the animal's welfare is measured by its productivity. What would animal welfare science be? That's a field now. It would be studying the most productive ways to squeeze more profit out of the animals. Yeah, everything. You know, cheapest feed for the most eggs, that kind of thing. All right? On the other hand, if you take the FAWC, Farm Animal Welfare Council view of welfare, your efficiency would be constrained by the need to acknowledge the animal's natural behavior, mental state, fear, and assured that there's minimum fear, strain, pain, distress, and discomfort, which would not even come up in the CAST report unless they ameliorated profits. You see? So I like this little turn that I came up with when I first started thinking about this. Not that science determines your view of welfare. Your view of welfare determines what counts as science. You see, so they got it assy-versy. And that, of course, leads people to talking past each other. Now, if the notion of animal welfare is inseparable from ethical components, and people's ethical stance on obligations to farm animals differs markedly across a diverse spectrum, the obvious question that arises is whose ethic will prevail, right? Because if the industry people prevail, then it'll be the most profit, the animal's well off. If not, it's going to be worried about the animal's comfort and so forth. So that's what I want to spend a little bit of time on. Has society had an articulated ethic for the treatment of animals historically? Yes, no, maybe. Yes. It's in the Bible even. And in every civilized country, it's been in law since about the late 1700s. And that's the law forbidding cruelty to animals. Okay? Which people at first blush think, so the animals are protected. But you really need to read the cruelty laws to get an idea of what a hollow sham it is. Cruelty means, according to all the laws, which I'm an expert on and have testified in a lot of cases and so forth, the various qualifiers of inflicting suffering on animals are unnecessary, unusual, deviant, purposeless, willful, deliberate, etc. Okay? And that means, essentially, that the anti-cruelty laws are directed against sadists and psychopaths, where Thomas Aquinas recognized that if you allow that behavior to animals, those people will graduate to people. And that's been proven, and nobody would know that better than Dr. Tedeschi, because there's a whole literature on that, on what's called the link, right, Phil? The link being that between cruelty to animals and cruelty to children, or cruelty to spouses, or cruelty to other people. I can't ever understand. There are things I can understand that are illegal. You know what I mean? I can understand beating the crap out of somebody that I don't get along with. I refrain from doing it, but I can understand it. What I can't even begin to understand is beating a child, you know? Or beating a woman, you know? I just don't get it. And my son is here, and he's a psychiatrist, and I've always told him in a very fatherly way, Mike, if you get a child abuser, do me a favor, beat the shit out of him, and I've got a fund for your legal defense. However, he's too much of an MD to do that, though he's been tempted, I'm sure. Right, Mike? So, there's actually a positive side of ethics that was traditional going back to the Bible. If you read the Bible, not you guys' Bible, the real one, the Old Testament, okay? You're not Jewish, are you, sir? You're shitting me.
Why is that shocking?
Well, because of the old joke, you don't look Jewish. Right? Does he look Jewish?
Should I just stand up?
Thank you for being a visual aid. That's the last time I'll pull that one. Something very similar happened in Rapid City, South Dakota. I was talking about, not really caring who I antagonize. when I talk. And there was this gigantic handlebar mustached redheaded cowboy who had to weigh 375 if he weighed an ounce, you know? And I said to him, I said, of course, that excludes you, sir. I don't want you pissed at me. The talk ended, he strides right up to me. And I said, this is not what I think it is it? He says, no, I just came to wish you good Shabbat, which is Yiddish for good Sabbath, you know? And I said, this don't reckon. Turned out he was actually a Jewish Christian. Do you know that sect? People who both believe in Judaism and Jesus, you know? I mean, they're out there. I didn't ask you to. We have a congregation in Fort Collins of those. Very nice people, largely beet farmers from Greeley. Don't ask me why. So anyway, the Bible does say some really nifty things. It says, for example, that you can violate the Sabbath if an animal falls down and can't get up. There are lots of things like that, and some of the things that are permitted are extremely important, like the Sabbath in Judaism. But you know, to help an animal, you can do it. In fact, you are obliged to avoid tsa'ar ba'alei chayim, which means the suffering of living things. You know? And what you got in the Bible was essentially the imperative of an agrarian society to treat the animals well if you want them to keep on producing for you. So all that was there. But in today's world, the cruelty laws don't even begin to touch the issue. Of all the suffering that animals experience at human hands, how much do you think is the result of deliberate, sadistic, purposeless, deviant cruelty?
1%.
Who said? You said that, sir?
Yes.
That's very good. That's very good. Actually, I can prove to you it's a lot less than 1%. But you're in the right neighborhood. A lot of people will say 70, 80%. No. Most of the animal suffering isn't from sadists and psychopaths. You know, we could curb those populations. It comes from perfectly laudable motives like feeding the masses, advancing scientific knowledge, blah, blah, blah. Okay? It doesn't come from cruelty. You know how many chickens we produce a year in America? Eating chickens. 11 billion. So let's say 10%. Let's take 10%. 10% of that would be 1.1 billion. Okay? If there was anything, and anywhere up to 40%, depending who you read, of those animals go to market broken and bruised. So that's a lot of suffering. If there was anything like 1 billion instances of suffering due to cruelty, you couldn't leave the house without seeing somebody set a cat on fire, and so forth and so on. That's very rare. And as people in social work have discovered, it's absolutely one of the most important indicators of further psychopathic behavior. What are the other two indicators? Starting fires and bedwetting. To my knowledge, Phil, nobody has shown the conceptual link between those. It just happens to be the case. You know? You're bad, you're really bad. Not only do you abuse children, you piss in the bed. Okay. So, obviously, if we're going to rectify some of these abuses, like raising chickens that end up broken and bruised, partially because of the way we raise them, we've built them by traditional genetic engineering breeding to reach full maturity a lot faster than a chicken would have. The eating chickens are full size in 7 weeks, what used to be 6 months. Shocking, isn't it? And the musculoskeletal system hasn't been bred to accommodate that. So the animals are suffering from bruises and fractures and all these sorts of bad things. Now, again, it's nobody deliberately trying to hurt them. It's an unfortunate consequence of supplying cheap food and plentiful food. So, what's occurred in the last half century that has moved the need for social ethics from opposition to cruelty to something much, much broader? You guys want to weigh in? So? No, I mean, give me a paragraph. So far, you're all right. Need for more food, you're saying? Yeah, and that's right. Right, and that's driven the industrialization of agriculture, you know? What I love to do is when I go to ag meetings, I was at a feedlot meeting a year ago, and this guy gets up, well, you obviously don't care if we feed the world. I said, neither do you, sir, unless they pay for it. You know? Left him speechless. He must have thought I was an idiot, you know? That they still do it. They'll still come like lemmings. Gotta feed the world. What if they don't pay for it? Hell with them. Oh, no. I mean, you know? Guys hear it in your head? Good. So, good, she's right. One thing is increasing demand. What else? That too. That too. People don't raise their own food anymore. Do you know what percentage of the public is in animal agriculture? Under 1.
I'm thinking the rise of other liberation movements.
No question. That's good. That's good. I've distinguished 5 factors. We could augment them. One is changing demographics. Go back 130 years, half the population was on the farm producing food for themselves and the rest. Now it's under 1% raising animals on the farm. Okay? There's a little thought experiment you can do. Ask yourself what would happen. Well, what would happen if you went out on the street now in Denver or New York and asked the first person you see, what's the first word you think of when I say animal? What are they going to say? Dog, cat, right? Pet. If you did that 150 years ago, what would people say? Good. Horse, cow, food, work. You're exactly on. So that test in itself tells you that people are thinking differently. You know? 50% of people in catastrophes, according to FEMA, will not be rescued if they can't take their animals. Do you know how astounding that is? You've got people here studying grief at pets. When I was growing up in Brooklyn, you laughed at it. I remember a lady on my block who was running around the street screaming and crying with her dead little dog in her hands, and she was yelling, "First my mother, now you." And people said, "Oh, Florence, get a life. Just a dog, you know?" Try that today and see what happens. Starting in 1980, CSU employed 2 full-time grief counselors. Why? Because it isn't only little old ladies. We had a biker gang come in, scared the hell out of all these social worker ladies. They came in with a sick chihuahua, and the chihuahua died while in the hospital. And they wouldn't let the bikers ride because they were so grief-stricken, they would have been a danger to themselves and others. And they're not ashamed of it. I'm a hero at the Harley shop. for what I do, you know? Because there is this Robin Hood element in bikers, you know what I mean? It's, there are worse people. Dare I say administrators? No. No. What this gentleman said is absolutely right. We've lived through 50 years at least of ethical soul searching in all the areas I mentioned earlier, shining an ethical searchlight on women, the handicapped, blacks, other minorities, etc. Finally, on the non-human world. And as part of the non-human world, on animals. Okay? Many of the people who led in the animal movement come out of other movements. Feminist movement, environmental movement, just a natural kind of link. And people who come from those other movements will tell you it's a natural link. You know? Shit on by society is shit on by society. Disenfranchised is disenfranchised. The media has discovered that animals sell papers. As I started to tell you the story of baby Faye, the reporter said to me, I said, I'll spend an hour with you and I'll explain to you what the immorality in that experiment was. He said, listen, if it's not about animals, I don't want to hear it. Animals sell papers. Animals sell papers. Do you remember about 15 years ago there were 2 whales trapped in an Arctic ice floe, a ring of ice, and they couldn't get out? Any of you remember how they got out? Right, an icebreaker. Good. 50 points for you. For the other 50, who's... There was a movie? Who sent... What'd she play, the icebreaker?
No, she plays the one that actually gets in the water.
Really? Live and learn. Now tell me, who sent the icebreaker?
It was an oil, or the,
It was the Russians.
right,
Yeah.
but the oil company.
Yeah. Was this perhaps an overflow of Russian compassion? A notion that makes you laugh when you think of the Gulag, Stalin, the pogroms, right? No, it was somebody in the Kremlin was smart enough to realize that the cheapest way to win American public opinion was to let out the, oh, them Russians ain't so bad, they let the whales out. I said this at an international conference I was speaking with simultaneous translation, and being, you know, what we philosophy technically call an asshole, I went up to the table of Russians and I made the statement that I made to you guys. And the Russians were hilarious. They said, of course, do you think we're stupid? You know, all's fair in diplomatic war, you know. A fourth reason is a lot of prominent people have come out in favor of animals. Can you think of a woman who approximates the status of sainthood in America? Bingo. You're exactly right. Jane Goodall. I mean, have you heard Jane Goodall speak? Yes. Have you seen the crowds? I mean, it's amazing. She's a friend of mine. She wrote a preface to one of my books, you know? And she's like Mother Teresa. Yes. Except she actually does stuff, you know? This is one of the few movements in human history outside of the American Revolution that was sparked by philosophers. Peter Singer wrote the first animal book, came out in 1976. Mine was the second, came out in 1980. And both have been in print since then. You know what that's like for a philosophy book? We're not talking porn, you know? We're talking, if porn is yin, this is yang in spades, you know? But most important to the point I want to make is changes in the nature of animal use that have taken place. For virtually all of human history, and how old is animal agriculture? Anybody take a wild guess?
8,000?
More, 10 or 11, okay? And for all that history, the key to agricultural success was good husbandry. That meant taking the animals, putting them into the optimal environment, and then augmenting their ability to survive and thrive by providing food during famine. Oh, goddamn cell phone. What would I have besides an Irish drinking song from the 1960s? So anyway, you took the animals, put them into the best possible environment you could find, given their natures, and then augmented their ability to survive and thrive by providing food during famine, water during drought, protection from predation, help in birthing, all those sorts of things. And why did people do this? What was the sanction for not doing it?
Your animals died.
Right, and didn't produce, and you didn't have any money. So it became both a pragmatic and an ethical imperative. You want to see dynamite proof of this? When the psalmist, the guy who wrote the Psalms, is looking for an ideal metaphor for God's ideal relationship to humans, what does he come up with? Bingo. Right, the Lord is my shepherd, shall not want, etc. That was the paradigm by which agriculture operated. And it worked quite well until the mid-20th century, which is one tiny fraction of the history of agriculture. And I consider it an experiment that failed. And it's something I say to the ag people too. Because we discovered, it was inevitable. You know, there was some confluence of factors, like, for example, the Dust Bowl, the Depression. For the first time in American history, people were scared of starving. You know, genuinely scared of starving. And it looked like we might not be able to supply the requisite amount of food. And of course, Henry Ford had invented the industrialization of industry. You know what Henry Ford said about slaughterhouses? They're disassembly lines, which was really very, very, very precocious on his part. So the idea would inevitably arise that you could raise animals using industrial methods. And that's the definition of animal science today. If you look it up in animal science textbooks, it has the chilling one-line definition, the application of industrial methods to the production of animals. Nothing about care, you see? And that's exactly what it is, you know? So, for example, just to take one dark example, in feedlots they feed cattle grain. Grain is not a natural diet for cattle. Grasses are, forage. With grain, they grow faster and bigger, okay? But 2 or 3% of them get liver abscesses, which condemns the carcass. So what? Because the rest produce enough to make up for it. And there's your industrial mentality. And cattle people are the best. I'm going to make that point very shortly. You see? Why do they raise pigs in little boxes? Less labor costs. Easier to observe. You don't need people with husbandry skills. You see? You just go and you make sure the automatic feeder is working. And how many of you have been around pigs? You work with them at all? Play with them? You raised them, good. Pigs are very smart. Probably smarter than dogs. Take an animal like that, put her in a cage, 2 feet wide by 3 feet high by 7 feet long, and I've been in those sow barns where she's bigger than the place she can lie down. So she lies bent, okay? Take an animal like that, who in nature will cover a mile a day foraging, and trade off watching the babies with other sows. The industry will tell you, you can't leave sows together, they'll fight to the death. Lying bastards, you know? It's not true. You've seen it, I'm sure. Just a damn lie. And people believe it because they don't know any better, you know? By the way, you should come here, Wayne Pacelli. I don't hold a lot of book for radical animal groups, but Wayne is different. Wayne is just absolutely superb, 100% honest, doesn't lie, you know? And that's why he's good, and that's why he wins. He ran 9 referenda in 9 states to abolish battery cages, sow stalls, and veal crates, and he won in every state. I settled with Colorado, with him, to avoid a referendum. And so, as a result, I'm on a committee that picks low-hanging animal welfare fruit before anybody has to come and remind us, you see? And Wayne he's the most honorable man I've ever met in the animal movement. He says something, and he stands 100% behind it. And he's very smart, and he's worth hearing. Of course, the rednecks have a saying about him. Have any of you seen him? Nice-looking guy, right? The rednecks say he's converting half the population one woman at a time. Displaying deep respect for women, right? Okay. So you had the movement from animal husbandry to animal science. You had the rise of massive amounts of research on animals, mostly for the sake of safety testing, you know? And most of those safety tests don't guarantee anything. I did a calculation one time. There's a registry of toxic substances. If you have trouble sleeping, you could curl up with it and you'll be asleep in 5 minutes. But of those, I think something like, I think there's 800,000 toxic substances. 10,000 have been tested in isolation. Now take 50,000 or 80,000 in various combinations, and you realize that safety testing is a quixotic and impossible task. And in fact, it's done much better with non-animal models, and they're starting to move that way with molecular tests and so forth and so on. But I mean, that caused a lot of suffering to a lot of animals because their idea of toxicology is the LD50. Do you know what that is? The dose, the minimum dose of a substance that kills 50% of the animals, and not nicely. Somebody in 1978 did a LD50 for distilled water. You know what that means? They forced water in the animals until they died. Nothing toxic about the animal except the mechanical pressure that it's going to produce in the intestines, you know? Science marches on. Now, I would not say that farmers are intentionally cruel. In 50 years, we've moved to 90% of the sows that we raised in those confinement situations. It's the economics of scale. It's the public naivete about their food, you know? That's a big irony, by the way. The ag people say, we got to show folks where their food comes from. You show them where it comes from, they won't buy it. You know? I finally blew up at a Farm Bureau meeting and said, you know, you're an idiot. Because if you take a person through the whole process of creating bacon, you can bet your bippy they'll never buy bacon again, let alone eat it. So just stop the bullshit, you know? This country runs on, look what's happening now in Congress. We ought to throw them all the hell out. I'm serious. That's how ordinary people feel. Who are they representing? And themselves. their own interests. They're villains and scallywags. Whatever a scallywag is. What's a scallywag, Mike? Okay, well, this industrial agriculture, what kind of problems does it create for animals? You ever hear what production diseases are? I gave you an example of one with the diet that's fed the feedlot cattle. It's a disease that would not be disease except for how you produce the animals. And there are whole textbooks of that, which to me is the shame of veterinary medicine. You shouldn't be treating those, you should be preventing them. Am I wrong? That's how ordinary people think. No more is there individual attention. I don't know if any of you know dairy farmers that had 10 or 15 cows. Anybody? Cows had names, right? Came when they were called.
Even when you had 50, they had names.
There you go. Right? And they related to them and they cared about them and all that. Now you've got dairies with 15,000 cows. And they don't have names. They have numbers. That's a big difference. Your dog has a name. There's research by a sociologist, anthropologist, that indicates that research labs forbid the technicians to name the dogs. Why would that be? Exactly. For the same reason the Nazis put everybody in concentration camp in the same uniform, so they became seen as interchangeable. Does that make sense? Huge issue, to me the biggest issue, is the deprivation. The animals have natures, just like humans have natures, right? Any ordinary person, if you're not a molecular biologist, is going to believe there's a pigness to a pig, a cowness to a cow, certain things that are dictated by its heredity and expressed in its environment, that you harm it if you don't let it do those things. Some of those things are more important than pain. When a coyote will chew his leg off to get out of a trap, that means freedom is more important to it than pain, because it must hurt to chew your leg off. You see? You cavalierly ride roughshod over these animals' natures in order to keep food cheaper. That's wrong. We can afford to pay a lot more for food than we do. So what do? We take the disposable income and we spend it on those idiotic iPhones. Everybody got an iPhone here?
We know you do.
I don't. That's not an iPhone. That is the original cell phone. That was developed in Bulgaria. No, basically this is a leash my wife gives me. But I don't need the damn iPhone with those stupid games on it. And you're culpable, you little bastard. His mother all day plays, what is it, Jeopardy with him? Wheel of Fortune. This is a smart guy, you know. Thank you. Thank you. Another hole in my heart. The fourth major modality of concern is that to work with pigs, you had to know pigs historically, even in your generation, right? You wouldn't hire somebody off the street. That's what they hire for these farms, these factory farms, because it's button pushing. In many cases, they know nothing about the animals. It's interesting. I've been in a lot of confinement pig barns, and I asked a worker there, how do you feel about this? I said, off the record, I won't quote you, how do you feel about this? He wouldn't talk. He stopped talking altogether, in fact. I felt bad for asking him, because he clearly had it all bottled up. You know what I mean? It was obvious from his facial expression. And you know, I have talked about the effect that these systems have on the people who work in them. There are sow barns in Iowa where you have to wear a respirator. You must. The animals don't have a respirator. Okay? I want to tell you two stories that are just beautiful. They illustrate the difference between industry and husbandry. I've lectured to 25,000 cowboys. Any of you from cowboy background? Ranch background? Okay, I got to tell you, I love those people. Their ethic is not that different from mine. You may think, you know, that they're a bunch of redneck. They're not. They really care about the animals, and this story illustrates it. I was up in, where the hell was I? Not far from actually Mule Creek Junction, Wyoming. You know where that is? Of course not, you're Jewish. What would you be doing in Mule Creek Junction? Right. Did you lecture in Mule Creek Junction? Tell the truth. No, I was up there in Mule Creek Junction, and for a friend of mine named Chuck Sylvester, who has 2 ranches in Wyoming, used to run the stock show, if that sounds familiar to you. And he was being hassled by the Bureau of Land Management. You know, he was despoiling the environment or some bullshit like that, you know? And that's a good story in itself, because I ate those guys' lunch, the BLM guys. I just ate their lunch. And now I can't buy my own dinner up there, you know? I'm a good guy. But that's not what I wanted to talk about. We had breakfast with 15 ranchers, and out of cussedness, I asked them, how many of you spent more on a calf than the calf is worth? Sir, you tell me. All of them. Every single, all 15. And in fact, one lady was there. She had just lost her husband, so she was stressed. She said to me, what's wrong with that, Buster? Buster? I said, well, man, I mean, rising to the bait, if you're producing widgets and it costs you $20 to make a widget, you don't sell them for 15. She said, that has nothing to do with it. She said, we're raising living things that are dependent on us. And every time they stay up all night watching a marginal calf in front of the fire, they're valuing their sleep at 40 cents an hour. Am I right, sir? And they all do it. They all do it. You know? And I've gotten to know some of these people intimately well. And some of the things that are forced on them but by what they think their tradition means is heartbreaking. One guy asked me to come with him pheasant hunting. And it was a classic picture in the snow-covered cornfield, you know? The dog flushes up the pheasant. He shoots it, and then he starts to run. And there's blood on the snow, you know? And when I finally caught up to him, he was sitting on the ground with the pheasant, crying. I said, Kenny, what's the matter? He said, I hate this shit. He had wounded it, and he had to wring its neck, you know? He said, I hate this shit. I said, well, let me ask you an obvious question. Why do you do it? He said, it's what I'm supposed to do. And I thought that was probably the saddest statement I'd ever heard, because that's what I'm supposed to do. Where is that written? You know? He was engaged to a woman at CSU who ran an office, and he broke off with her because, quote, she was gentlefolk and I'm scum. Sound familiar? Anyway, they're good people. And so every one of them said that they'd spend more on the animal than the animal's worth. The Denver Post did an article on slaughterhouses, and they actually polled ranchers. You know the percentage of ranchers who went to slaughterhouse? Virtually none. And the reason they gave was it's our job to give them a good life, not to figure out what happens to them, rightly or wrongly. Good people. My second story, This is the son of a rancher who taught at CSU. Son-in-law. And the ranch was too small to support the 5 siblings. So he was the youngest, so he went to work in a pig factory because he worked with pigs for 4-H, you know? And one day he detected a disease in the baby pigs, and he called the boss. And the boss said, "God damn it, you've been here 6 months. Didn't you learn anything?" He said, "What do you mean?" He says, "We don't treat sick animals, we kill them." And the kid says, "You let them die?" The boss says, "No." He picks up the baby pig by the back legs, smashes the head against the pen. That's called blunt trauma. And then throws the twitching, dying animal into a garbage heap. So the way he put it to me was, that's not how I was raised. You know? Remember, the parents are out there scrounging for some marginal little calf, you know, in the blizzard. So he says, I went out and I bought the medicine with my own money and came in on the weekend when I'm off and fed it to the animals, and they got better. And I called the boss and I told him I got good news. The animals are better. You know what the boss said? "You're fired. You're fired." Kid was smart. He had looked at his contract. He said, "You can't fire me. You know? I didn't do anything in violation of my contract. I worked extra hours and I spent my own money." You know? 6 months later, he quit. And he wrote a letter to his father-in-law that the father-in-law showed me. "Dear Dad, I am quitting. I'm going to electrician school. I know you're disappointed that I'm not in agriculture, but this ain't agriculture." Isn't that amazing? You know? So, okay, I'll come to the concluding part. Draw a sigh of relief. Where do you get a new ethic? All right? I mean, anybody can make up a new ethic. People do it all the time. They add God to it and they got a new religion, you know? I had a guy in my department who was complaining he doesn't make enough money. I said, "You're a Korean guy. You do all this tea ceremony stuff. Make some twists on it. Start your own religion." Most people won't pay attention. You get 1,000 people who give you $1,000. That's $1 million. I don't know if he did it or not. I don't want to know. But where do you get a new ethic? Ethics comes from pre-existing ethics, thank God. There are huge issues in any society, balancing the interests of the individual versus the interest of the group. All right? Totalitarian societies, group is everything, individual is nothing. Get in their way, shoot you. The other extreme is the anarchist communes of the 60s, the hippie communes. The individual is everything. That's why the commune didn't last. A friend of mine joined the wife-swapping commune. He said it was great till they wanted my wife. And then I quit. That's human nature. So our society, I think, is the best ever in that it balances these two. We make most of our social decisions by reference to the general welfare. But what's the problem? You learned this in elementary school. What's the problem of going by the majority interests and desires?
Sometimes they're wrong.
Yeah, what else? Well, it oppresses the minority, you know what I mean? If it's the majority, then fine, you know, sorry, too bad, you know? So our society makes most of our social decisions by reference to the general welfare, but protects the individual even from the general welfare with a little institution called rights, which are enumerated in the Constitution. And where did they get those rights? Somebody sit down with a Ouija board? No. They were the things that they knew in oppressed Europe that they missed the most. freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, holding on to your own property, avoiding people breaking in, beating the hell out of you at night, that kind of thing. Pretty good theory of human nature, actually, if you stop and think about it. And so the excesses of general welfare are checked by rights. It was obvious to me in the 70s that if we want to extend an ethic to animals, number one, it can't be made up out of nowhere. Number two, it needed to be what we already believe. And number three, that we needed to show that it fit animals. Animals have natures. They're not our natures, you know. Pigs don't want freedom of speech, but they do want to be able to move. And there are things that are as important to their natures as speech and religion are to ours. And following Aristotle, I call that nature telos. Scientists don't believe that's how the world is. They believe the world is just atoms. Or they think they believe that, except when they start dating. I told one scientist, well, if everything's just a bunch of atoms, why don't you date that pile of horse shit? You know? I'm serious. You know? I mean, the point is you can force yourself, are you a scientist, sir? As well as a Jew? No. Thank God. You understand what I'm saying? It's a very important concept that if we're going to use animals like they did throughout human history for agriculture, then we should respect their natures. It's true, we kill them. But while they live decent lives. And I can make a pretty strong case that animals who are killed painlessly don't know what's happening to them. And they have no desire for life in itself because they have no concept of life in itself because you need a language to have that. Okay? We can argue that, but it's certainly not the worst thing in the world to kill an animal painlessly. And could we do that? Yes, we could raise our ag animals like we raised them for 10,000 years and kill them painlessly. You see? What's the largest number of animals used for anything? 100 million rats and mice for animal research. You know how we kill 99% of those? Carbon dioxide. You know what carbon dioxide does? How many of you have ever taken a sniff of dry ice? Just frozen carbon dioxide. Takes your breath away. Any of you have asthma? Not pleasant, is it? That's what dying by carbon dioxide does. And I've been fighting them for 20 years, but the American Veterinary Medical Association proves it is humane. Screw them. Okay? There's an awful lot to fight in this area. An awful lot. That's why I'm not ready to die yet. I pissed off a bunch of people, but I got more. You know? Okay, so the rest of it follows very simply. As Canadian ministers of agriculture and forestry and all that said to me in 1980 when I did a whole day seminar for them, they said, well, obviously we need a Bill of Rights for animals. I said, bingo. You know, and it doesn't take Jane Goodall to figure out the basic needs of a cow or a chicken. I'll tell you one thing. You're not Jane Goodall, right? But you know that a mother pig does not need to be in a 2-foot box. We all know that. That's why 80% of us can't stand it. You see? And what we need is an informed general public to express themselves to the producers. Yeah, we'll pay another 20 cents. Take them out of the boxes. You know? But we have been blissfully ignorant. And that's one thing you can thank the activists for. It's very hard to be ignorant now. You know, with all the films and all that. That's why they're trying to make the ag-gag laws. The laws to make it illegal to film a farm. There's a great movie you guys can see, a documentary. I think you can buy it for 20 bucks. It's called Behind Closed Doors. Have any of you seen it? It is well worth seeing. It was made by an airline pilot who was converted to concern for animals by his girlfriend. You know, and it's really the most powerful common sense view you've ever seen on animal agriculture. Is this radical? In one sense of the original word, radical, which means get to the root. But it's actually politically conservative because we have 10,000 years of raising animals that way, not their way. See? Could we convert? Sure we could convert. It would have to be, in some sense, technologically based because we don't have infinite land for a small number of people. That doesn't mean we should give up completely, right? A lady in Wyoming got into big trouble when she said, give the prairie back to the buffalo. You can imagine how that flew in the Wyoming rancher-dominated legislature. But she still got her job. So that says something good, right? I believe this is going to get fixed. You know why? Because there is no more iconic image to people than a cow on pasture. You see? Not a cow in a stall tied down, attached to a milking machine. That's not iconic. What's iconic is the cow eating grass. Am I right? That's why those bastards in California depicted what they were doing is that. The Frank Perdue, the third biggest chicken producer in the East, he ran ads showing a barnyard and had the nerve to, for 15 years, to run voiceover, at Purdue we raise happy chickens. You ever see that? It was a lie. From start to finish, it was a damn lie. But it's a good lie because it tells us what people want to see. You know? There are poor people, and I think there will always be poor people, and I think we need to make sure that poor people eat and have dignity and all that other stuff. But that doesn't mean that the wealthier among us have to be able to buy chicken for the same price as it was in the 60s when I was a college student. Hershey bars were a nickel when I was a college student. They're $1.50 now. Nobody feels compelled to apologize for that. The apology is due to the chickens because the same price of chicken is on the back of those animals. Okay? So, I guess I can stop there. Thank you for listening.
Hopefully the students that I work with will tell you is that one of the things we do a lot of is ethics training.
God bless you.
And what I'm hoping is the field of animal-assisted social work could serve as a vehicle to elevate animal ethics and animal-assisted human connection. I'm wondering if you might give us some ideas for how...
Oh, it certainly won't hurt. It certainly won't hurt because for a variety of reasons, some dark, some not dark, the animal plays much more of a role in our lives than they ever did. Nobody's going to tell that woman it's just a dog, you know? My wife teaches logic for 25 years. My wife is intellectually off the scale. She has an IQ of 175. And thank God she's lazy, you know? But she's taught logic at CSU for 25 years. And she gave a pretest at the beginning of every logic class, Phil. The grades were the same for 22 years. The last 3 years, they've dropped a quartile. Why? Because they don't read and they don't talk. Am I wrong? So, I think the animal connection is becoming socially necessary for people. And as it becomes socially necessary, people will have more empathy. And the stuff you do is unambiguously good. You know what I mean? We're not getting drugs from it, we're not eating the dogs, you know what I mean? You're holding them in esteem. And my student there, Jen, God bless her, she just wrote a wonderful paper on service dogs and how there's absolutely no ethical concern for who the dogs are placed with. You know? Some of these returning soldiers can be psychopaths. And they could take out what they do on the dog. And we have a moral obligation to make sure that that doesn't happen. And that in itself can elevate moral concern towards animals. No, I unequivocally support everything you guys do as far as I can tell. I've even told my son here that he needs to get more involved with animals because his specialty is eating disorders. And I'm convinced you could help those people with, you know? To be cruel, it has to be deviant. If it's done by a certain subgroup of society, it's not deviant anymore. The cruelty laws desperately need reform because I just found out last year, Phil, the only things that can count as cruelty are physical damage. You torture an animal psychologically, no court will convict you. None. This is a friend of mine who's just a gentle giant, and he heard about some people in Nebraska from a friend or something who were, every morning they'd shoot the animals with paintball, this little baby bull mastiff, and the dog lived in a state of terror, so he bought the dog from them. It took him 5 years till the dog would let a man approach her. That to me is cruelty. You know what I mean? If whacking the animal over the head with a rake is cruelty, that's signal cruelty. And so, you know, bless you for what you do here. It's perfectly in accord with what I've tried to do for 35 years. But, you know, to tell you the truth, the whole vegan thing is not the answer. What the vegan thing does is show your sincerity and your earnestness and your concern in a way that means a lot to you. But it doesn't matter to the bad guys. His girlfriend, his former girlfriend, was a politically correct vegan in the most, you know, did this spoon ever touch meat? I won't use it, blah, blah, blah. And she got a hold of me one day and she said, you know, I've written to all the meat companies and said, I am a vegan and I won't eat your blah, 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 blah. They never answer me. I said, do me a favor, write them a letter and saying I'm a consumer of your product, but I'm very disturbed about sow stalls. And she got letters from the CEOs. You know? It isn't a matter of opting out, it's a matter of being less selfish than that, forcing change for the benefit of everybody. You see? What is an urban child going to know about, you know, in terms of the food they eat? And if we make sure they know, they're not going to eat badly. People are really good about animals, you know, and I'm cynical about human beings, right, Mike? Very cynical. Most of the time. Yeah. But I really believe that when it comes to animal ethics, people are very decent. I don't know if it's some primordial thing built into us. What we're doing to animals is not something that we do, so we don't know it. When you expand Fort Collins from a town of 30,000, which was when I got there, to a town of 160,000, you destroy habitat for wild animals, and you run them over, and all this kind of stuff.
Thank you, Bernie, very much for...
My pleasure. Thank you.